So thank you all so much for coming out tonight for this discussion. I'm Ashton Mara. I'm a professor here in the Reed College of Media. I'm also the executive editor of a nonprofit newsroom called 100 Days in Appalachia. And that project is what stemmed reporting on addiction and our work with Jonathan at the Opioid Policy Institute. So Jonathan and I have been working on this project along with Kristen Uppercue, who's in the back there, one of our graduates here from the Reed College. We've been working on reporting on addiction for about 2 years now and officially launched in September of 2021. Is that, I can't remember what year it was. It's been fun. So officially launched in September of last year for National Recovery Month. And over the past year have been working to share our resources and the things we've developed with professional student newsrooms, journalism educators, and even experts in this space and experts through lived experience to try to increase the number of people who are working with journalists so that we can reduce stigma in journalism around addiction. So a little bit, hopefully this will work. So we want to present you all with just a couple of slides as kind of like a base setting for the conversation that we're about to have. And then we're going to have a couple of questions for our panelists. And then at the end, you're going to take audience questions. And we know that there are folks here from each of these communities that we're trying to represent throughout this process. So please share your thoughts or concerns or questions or feedback with us. We'd really love to hear it. So we always kind of start from this place, like, why should we care about addiction, especially with journalists? Healthcare journalists are often the people doing the most reporting in this space. But I think we probably all know, whether we're journalists or not, that stories about addiction happen in every beat on every topic area. We see addiction issues intersecting with veterans issues and arts and culture, right? It's part of who we are as a country. Drug use is part of our national conversation constantly. We see them covered as criminal stories. We see them covered as political and policy stories all the time. So it doesn't really matter what space you're interested in. Addiction is always going to be part of that conversation. So we at Reporting on Addiction have come to this conversation from this central place. We do not believe that journalists want to harm their communities. There is nobody who we've worked with over the past 2 years who believes that journalists wake up in the morning and they think, I'm going to go work at the Dominion Post and try to make Morgantown worse. Nobody thinks that, right? We're not doing that. But what we try to educate people about is that the job of journalism is really, really difficult. And it's more difficult, I think, than a lot of people who are outside of the industry understand. We are required to cover multiple beats and sometimes cover those multiple beats in a single day. We have really, really tight deadlines. I have worked in newsrooms where I went in at 9 a.m. and my story needed to be completed with 2 voices, 2 interviews by 3 p.m. so my editor could see it. You have to turn things around really quickly. And we also know that there is not a lot of training in this space. Journalists often are not exposed to these topics, the medical science and the research in this space, and they're certainly not trained on how to do reporting in this area. We also know, and we try to remind journalists, that the stories that you are writing can impact your community. I think we as journalists have this baseline where we do think that, right? Like, that's why we got into this industry. But there are so many stories that we do that we think, oh, nobody's ever going to read this. Why does it even matter? But the things that we are doing every day have a massive impact on the things that our communities believe. Can't tell you how many times as a political reporter I sat in a random committee meeting in some tiny room at the state capitol and watched a state lawmaker hold up a newspaper that said, well, the Charleston Gazette-Mail says this, so we have to do something, right? We can have a drastic impact on policy and the way our communities think about these topics. So it's really important that we are all working together. It cannot all be on journalists, although there is some responsibility there, but it's important that we all work together to improve reporting in this space in our various ways. We have found that there is kind of a problem in the training cycle of journalists who are reporting on this topic. So We start our training as students, right, in places like this in the Reed College, and we are exposed most often to just the basics. How to do a story, how to conduct an interview, how to write things down on a page in a way that people can understand. But we don't necessarily dig into a lot of those complex, complicated topics, or we don't get to do that all the time. So then these student journalists move on and they become early career journalists, usually at small news operations in local communities. And in those newsrooms, because we have this lack of training about this topic in particular, those young journalists are relying on more experienced journalists in the newsroom to teach them, and those experienced journalists don't really have the proper training to begin with. So we kind of have this cyclical thing happening where older and more experienced journalists haven't necessarily been exposed to the science and to the research. Young student journalists and early career journalists go into their newsrooms and they look to those more experienced journalists for help, but they don't have the resources that they need to do this kind of coverage. So that's where we are trying to come in. That's why we train professional newsrooms and try to help career journalists do better reporting on this topic. And that's why we're also trying to create curriculum and using curriculum in classrooms, and also training student newspapers so that Jonathan and I always say we're playing the long game. Like we didn't decide that we could fix this thing in 2 years. Like it's going to take a decade or more for us to start seeing substantial change in this place. But in this space, but it's because we are doing both, because we are working with those senior journalists and editors, and because we are preparing the next generation of journalists, that we are hoping we can shift the way that this journalism is happening. I'm going to hand things over to Jonathan here.
I'm a little taller. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. So my name is Jonathan Stoltman. I'm director of the Opioid Policy Institute. So my background is addiction science and addiction research. I've been doing that for about 10 years. We've been working with Ashton and Kristen and the partners at 100 Days to really get this project going. And I have seen that talk a bunch, but I'm always still inspired by how we talk about journalists, and I think it's wonderful. So I get tasked with trying to explain what is addiction, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about what addiction is, how it works. So we'll do a little bit brief level setting with this. And I love this definition from ASAM. It came out within the last couple of years. And it just says, addiction is a treatable chronic medical condition involving complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, and an individual's life experiences. People with addiction use substances or engage in behaviors that become compulsive and often continue despite those consequences. And then prevention and treatment efforts and approaches for addiction are generally as successful as those for other chronic diseases. So what do we mean when we talk about chronic diseases? We're talking about cardiovascular disease, asthma, and if you get those evidence-based approaches, the outcomes are really similar. Most people don't get those evidence-based approaches. We're really fortunate to be joined by Laura Lander. I'll introduce her in a second, who is a provider who works on those evidence-based approaches. But she can, of course, talk about those problems with access. So I think this is a great, level set, hopefully. And when we do the longer trainings, we spend like 20 minutes breaking down every single part of this definition, because every single word that they chose for the ASAM definition really, really matters. But that's not for today. And then when we're talking about addiction, we're really talking about the full spectrum. So again, as Ashton pointed out, it's going to come across various beats that you're doing, and it'll really touch on all different parts of addiction. So what can be included in that? Efforts like prevention. The state of West Virginia has some new prevention efforts that they're rolling out. Are they evidence-based? Those are wonderful questions to be asking as journalists and community members. Of course, addiction itself that we just defined, and then harm reduction, treatment, and recovery services. And so a lot of the stories that we talk about when we think about addiction in the news and in the media is around like the development of addiction. Very few stories talk about individuals in long-term recovery. We have Mark, and we're very lucky to have him here today to share his experience as an individual in long-term recovery and talk a little bit about some of those gaps in the coverage that we see. So that's a lot of what we're trying to get the media to focus on, is that fuller understanding of both what addiction is and how addiction looks across those different domains. But of course, the big focus is addiction, stigma, and discrimination. So what do we mean when we talk about stigma? Because it's a kind of ephemeral term, and it's a term that's thrown around a lot. But addiction stigma is that just general thing in the ether that when we talk to community members, talk to friends or family members, it's this belief that addiction isn't that medical disease. It's this moral failing, it's this personal choice, and it's a weak individual who is engaged in these problematic behaviors, and that is why they are now addicted. And you can tell, hopefully, that the definition that ASAM gives is totally opposite of that stigma sort of backbone that we hear and talk about and see in our communities, we see in our current reporting. And so why does that matter? Like, why does it matter for journalists? And there's a bunch of different domains of stigma. Again, I won't torture you with those today. But one of the big ones is public stigma. So this is that idea that, again, people who use drugs, they're dangerous, they're immoral, they're people that I don't want to be around, they're people that I don't want to employ. And this is oftentimes perpetuated still in news media stories and reporting on the topic. So what does that lead to? That leads to discrimination. And discrimination is that action of the stigma. So the stigma is the belief, discrimination is the action. And so how does that manifest? It manifests as, well, I'm not going to hire someone that had an addiction because they're a bad person. Why would I ever hire that person? I don't want to rent to them. I don't want them in my building. I don't want to talk to them. I don't want to be around that person because that is a bad person. And so obviously that shunning and pushing to the margins of society is deeply problematic for both the individual with an addiction, an individual in long-term recovery, and those family members that are associated, loved ones that are associated with that individual. And hopefully you can kind of see how that all pieces together. But our goal is, of course, by reducing stigma, we want to see that reduction in how stigma and discrimination manifests in our real world. And then, of course, no conversation about stigma is complete without talking about the intersectional elements. When we talk to journalism students, they love intersectionality. We love that. Intersectionality is just the idea that there's layers to any individual. We're all onions, I guess. And so when we have all of these different layers, stigma and addiction is just one part of the individual. But if we layer something else, like they're from Appalachia or from West Virginia, people outside this community already have an idea of what that person is. It's usually not a good idea, and some of that's because of our media narratives. Pregnant people are a lot of who Laura and I work with. You layer an individual that's pregnant or has children and the experiences that they have, and then the media narratives around that. Again, it gets harmful, and it just kind of amplifies and really spins out of control. So hopefully this kind of, again, draws some of those lines for you here about why we're talking about stigma and discrimination and sets the stage here for our wonderful speakers. And then I did want to talk really briefly, because as Ashton said, we've been around for a year, which is pretty sweet. And we've had 3 different domains that we've been trying to have impact in. And I just want to talk a little bit about the different impacts that we've already had in our first year. So we do those professional journalists trainings. We work with professional newsrooms. We've worked with about half a dozen professional newsrooms. We talk for 90 minutes, 2 hours, give them this baseline of information, and then support their reporting long term. I still have people call me, unfortunately, on like a Sunday, and they're like, I got this pitch. I got to figure out what to do. Can you help me? And so that reach out is amazing, because now we can see and help them try to think about these stories in different ways. And the uptake of that has been really, really powerful and wonderful. And of course, I work with about 34 journalists one-on-one, from pitching to like all the way through the end of their process, help source stories. It's really very fun, a lot of work, but it's having an impact, and it's growing, which is really exciting. And it just gets out there. Like I had the Today Show call last week because they wanted to figure out how to cover a story about rainbow fentanyl, if you've seen that. And I'd never reached out to the Today Show. They just kind of like found us, which is wonderful. So we're having an impact, but we also make a lot of work to have an impact. University outreach. So we work with West Virginia University, of course. All of you are here for that. But we're at 4 different universities as well for our journalism curriculum. This is our first semester doing that. We did a bunch of training, all this fun stuff. We already have another 5 or so for next semester, and that continues to grow. So those journalism students, they're getting this from the get-go. And they know, hey, in 5 years, if I have a story, there are these people that know something about it, and I can reach out to them. So that's been wonderful. And then we also have 5 different student newspapers, including the West Virginia newspaper, but from various states: Utah, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, and North Carolina, which you cannot see because that's not a good color purple. And then experts. So we work a lot with experts. We want them to be media trained and them to know how to interact. So as Ashton said, journalists have a hard job. If I can't find somebody to give me a quote, then of course I'm going to just run with the information that I already know. So we need experts to know both how journalists work and the value of working with journalists, which we'll talk a little bit more about here today. So we have 80-plus experts on our database that we've worked with already, which has been really wonderful growth. And we've done 5 national training events to help get those folks. And, of course, get the word out that working with your media, local, don't just wait for the Washington Post to call. your local news is what drives local decisions. It's what drives local policy. And I know all of you agree with that, but it's a lift. It's trying to convince folks that local news really matters. So we're doing that work, and we're having a lot of fun with it and have had some wonderful impact. So what we're going to do now is have a wonderful panel discussion. I gave some teasers, but I'll have Laura, if you want to come up first. Laura, do you want to introduce yourself? I think that you have a mic, yeah, so you can mic it up, and then Mark, yeah. So Ashton, she's our journalist. Laura, if you want to.
Hey everyone, I'm Laura Lander. I'm social work faculty in the Department of Behavioral Medicine and Psychiatry here at WVU in the School of Medicine. So I think I'm here representing the treatment side of things, and I also tend to be asked to interview with various journalists, and I've done some interviews with student journalists as well, which is always delightful because often they don't have a lot of preconceived ideas around stigma, and it's really nice because they're often really open to learning about how to present stories about recovery and addiction in really non-stigmatizing ways. So it's been a wonderful partnership.
Hello, yes, my name is Mark Jackson, and I am a person in long-term recovery. I met Ashton some years ago when she was a reporter with WDTV, and since then she's reached out several times and asked me to participate in several events, and I'm always willing to do that. As a person in long-term recovery, I do work with the Governor's Initiative Jobs and Hope West Virginia. I work with other individuals who struggle with substance abuse or incarceration to help them overcome whatever barriers or obstacles they're dealing with so that they can become employable and get back into the workforce.
I think they know me.
Yeah, probably.
Okay.
I hope so. So we're going to start. We're just going to do a discussion and get some insights from various panel members, and then, like Ashton said, we'll do some Q&A as well. Mark, I wanted to start with you, if that's okay. So how can you, convince people that it's important to work with the media, and talk about some of the value that you have found in working with the media?
Well, early on, at the very beginning, I was listening to Ashton as she was sharing about the political and all the different aspects of what the journalism is about. One of the things that I want individuals to understand is don't forget about the human side of this story, because oftentimes you hear the who, what, where, when, and why, but you got to hear that human part of it, that individual, because once you've sat down and you've talked to an individual, now you start to get a little bit of an understanding. Maybe you don't understand the disease of addiction, but the one thing that you do understand is here's an individual who could very easily be my brother, my uncle, my cousin, someone in my family, someone that I love. So I'll tell this story from that point of view with some empathy instead of, okay, well, this individual on drugs did, You know what? Here's an individual who's struggling with, when that story is told with some passion or some compassion, then individuals in the community tend to take it in a little differently.
Yeah, I think, Laura, do you want to go ahead first?
Yeah, I see the media and journalists as a potential really vehicle for change. How do we change culture? Media is really important in that change and in terms of changing the culture to be less stigmatizing towards individuals with substance use disorder. The media has to be part of that conversation in some ways. I get really focused on language and stigmatizing language, so that's often what I'll talk with journalists about. How can we use language that's compassionate and that's not blaming the person for their disease? And it's not about political correctness. It's actually about not continuing to carry forth a sort of a sense of blame for something that people did not create. So when we think about addiction and the definition that Jonathan shared, certainly environment is a component. But when we think about all kinds of diseases, there's usually a genetic component as well as a behavioral component. So when you think about type 2 diabetes, there are many people who would never develop type 2 diabetes if they kept their weight under control, and they ate really healthy. Addiction is very similar, except once the disease is active and becomes activated and that genetic kind of switch gets flipped, there's no turning back. And at that point, it's very important to invite people into treatment, to offer options like harm reduction if they're not ready for treatment, and do so in a non-stigmatizing way. And the media and how they portray treatment and harm reduction and have these conversations can have a huge impact on cultural change.
Yeah, I think I was going to say the same. This kind of topic, change in the space, feels impossible, and it feels overbearing, and like we can't possibly do it. How could we shift the way that our country views and thinks of people who have a substance use disorder? But if we think about it in smaller chunks and the change that we as local journalists can have on our individual communities, I mean, we've seen that change happen. I've seen stories that I did at my tiny TV station in Bridgeport, West Virginia, change the way that people thought about and approached me when talking about specific issues. So I agree. I think it's about impact. And thinking about impact in those small chunks, that we can change that culture over time if we focus on the things that are happening in our communities today and how we talk about and approach those topics in our communities right now.
Also, I would like to add that it's important for individuals in recovery to keep in mind that the media are experts in journalism and media. They're not experts in every single topic that they report on. So if we as individuals in recovery aren't willing to sit down and hold that conversation, you have to be informed. You have to get that information from somewhere. So it's important that individuals in recovery actually sit down and hold those conversations, those who are comfortable to do that.
This is why I forced Mark to come to everything.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. And Laura, I got a tricky one for you. So we know with recovery and long-term recovery that there are so many different paths that individuals can take. But sometimes those paths don't involve evidence-based approaches or evidence-based treatments. What would you recommend for journalists trying to cover this space and talking about kind of not issue, but some of the nuance behind, we want to talk about evidence-based approaches, but recognizing, there's still access issues, like massive ones, there's discrimination, all of those things.
So we were actually talking about telehealth earlier, and telehealth has revolutionized access, at least from my small experience with it during COVID. We have people accessing treatment who could never access treatment in the past because they didn't have a vehicle and they couldn't get to Morgantown, or they had kids and they didn't have childcare and they weren't allowed to bring their children to their group therapy. And so making access easier is a huge part of that. And that transportation and childcare are not the only barriers to access. Certainly stigma is a barrier to access. So when I think of evidence-based treatments, they're obviously important. We need to study what we do and make sure what we're doing is effective. But when we think about change, the basis of what motivates people to change, it's really fundamentally that it becomes more uncomfortable to stay the same. And I don't know that that's an evidence-based treatment. It's just more about human behavior. And so how do we create an environment in which it's easier to seek sobriety than continue to use substances? And that's what's going to sort of prompt people to seek treatment. There are many pathways into recovery and into sobriety. Some people don't ever get treatment and are still successful in their recovery. So it's important to think about those things as well. Evidence-based treatment is based on a large population. What works for a large population does not necessarily work for me. As an individual, I may be, the 1% that didn't work for. So leaving room for individualism and having conversations about what's going to work for you is really important when we think about inviting people into recovery.
And I would like to add on to that. In West Virginia, as we say, there's more than one way to skin a cat. I remember at one point in time when I was having some issues with my back, the first thing that my doctor did was send me to a chiropractor. And then when that didn't go great, he gave me a non-narcotic muscle relaxer, and it did a little something. But then after that, he turned around and he sent me to a physical therapist. So, you know, for that disease, and we are talking about a disease when we talk about addiction, for that disease, there were numbers of ways that the doctor could work with me to help me get over that hurdle. And with addiction, we have to keep in mind that there are more than one way than just, you know, the evidence-based treatments to get over that hurdle. My father, you know, case in point, my father drank a bit when he was a younger man. He liked getting in pretty good. And he never went to treatment or anything like that. My mother blessed him out real good one evening, and that pretty much brought a halt to that. My father stopped drinking, and I only saw my father drink maybe once or twice in about the last 40 years of his life afterwards. So, you know, people can stop. However, there are some very good programs out there to help individuals who don't know where to start.
I'll just say quickly, we really push in our trainings and in our talks with journalists that everyone's path to recovery is valid, but nobody's story is universal. And that is really complicated for journalists when we are trying to approach these stories. It's really difficult to not fall back on those narratives. Narratives that have worked for us in almost every other space, right? Storytelling structures in those formats that have worked in a lot of spaces. That nuance makes it really difficult to tell these kinds of stories. But I think that one point can really help us through it. Everybody's path to recovery is valid, but nobody's is universal.
Sure. Thank you. That's wonderful. And Ashton, I have one for you. Can you talk a little bit more, I know you hinted at it, at some of the barriers that are faced in newsrooms when reporting on this space?
Yeah, I think we talked about these a little bit in the beginning and kind of our preview of how we decided to, or how we have framed the resources that we've created and the trainings that we do. We recognize, and I think that's what makes us different than a lot of other folks who have done some work in this space, is that at no point in their creation of resources do they ever think to ask a journalist why they are telling stories in the way that they do, and the challenges that they are facing that make it difficult to do this job. So for folks who are here and maybe don't know what professional journalists do, we talked about these things. The deadlines are incredibly tight, and there are absolutely no resources. I mean, it is very rare to be in a newsroom where you get whatever you ask for. It doesn't happen, right? We have to work with the bare bones of what we can do on a daily basis. Often people are, and Dr. Lander is fantastic, so this is not directed at her, but oftentimes folks who are working in medical and scientific research spaces are overwhelmed with the work that they are doing themselves, and they can't take the time to respond to a journalist who needs to turn a story in the next 2 hours. And so while we may do the work or attempt to do the work to make our stories more complete and more contextual and more accurate, we also have that deadline coming up, and there's nothing we can do to get past it because the 6 o'clock news goes on the air at 6 o'clock. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. It has to be on the air. So those, the resources, the lack of training that we discussed, those deadlines that just don't quit, those are all really difficult things that we often take to experts and say, look, I think that we could get along if we just understood how everybody's job worked. That's the baseline. If you could just understand my job, I think you'd be much more willing to be a part of it and to help us out. And they do seem really receptive when we talk to them about that. But it's a lack of understanding how journalism works. And so there are several journalists in this room, and what I would encourage you to do is just say that. Say, especially the young journalists, people do not understand how your job works. Tell them how it works. I've got to have somebody on camera because I work for a TV station. We make assumptions and think that people know that. I've got to have my story done by 6 p.m., so I've got to have a response by then. We can't expect them to respond in the way that we want them to if they don't understand the limitations of the work that we are doing.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Go ahead, Mark.
If I may, I'm not a journalist, but I would like to offer this as well to the journalists. Instead of always doing reactive journalism, do proactive journalism. If you go out and you create a bank of resources before situations happen, you meet individuals, you talk to people, when things do happen, you've got a fallback. I tell people on my job, I'm a resource broker. I go when things are happening, I always like to put my nose in the door. If they've got pamphlets or whatever, cards, I'm always gathering those resources so that anytime I may need to reach back on a resource, it's like, oh, wait a minute, where are those cards I had? I can fall back through those cards, start to reach back. And through that 6 degrees of separation, knowing someone who knows someone.
Yeah, wonderful. Mark, I have one for you and Laura, of course. We've talked a lot about the importance of working with journalists, but I think it's worth also addressing that there are some risks associated with working with journalists. And maybe if you can not necessarily share personal experience, but talk a little bit about those risks to help better inform folks like yourself who may be listening.
Well, one of the biggest risks is that stigma can always come back and bite you. I had occasion to work with Miss Call in the back here some years ago at WBOY. And it was when I was early recovery. And I'm sure she probably didn't know until about now that I was a person in recovery. But, one of the things is if you throw that out there too soon in early recovery, then it can come back and bite you. It can cost you. And it depends on what profession that you're going into. For me, it just so happened that I've worked in professions that have been in trades somewhat or here in the substance abuse arena. And, it's played to my favor this way. But, I caution individuals, it's not on the application. If it doesn't ask about it, I'm not running to jump out there and throw that information out there on the table for someone. But once I've been with them for a little while, I feel comfortable. Then it's information that I may want to share if that information is necessary, if it's needed.
Yeah, Laura, did you have anything to add, maybe previous experiences or?
Yeah, so I think early in my career, I was mistrustful of the media and journalists for fear that they would take what I was saying and twist it to fit whatever might be, the purpose of the story. And I think I've adjusted my behavior, and I usually lead with, I'm only going to talk to you if you promise not to present this material in a way that's stigmatizing towards people with substance use disorders. I kind of just lead with that, and not that would, I don't know what someone who was going to be stigmatizing would do with that information. I recently did have an experience where I felt like the language that I used was taken out of context, and it made me sound stigmatizing, and so that was really hard. But I also had to just kind of let that go, and maybe I need to choose my words more carefully. And so it's a balance, and I agree with what Ashton was saying, letting each other know what our perspective is from the journalist side, as well as from the treatment provider side or from the recovery side. And what's important to us, like I have a deadline, or like I have 6 patients and I can't talk to you until 5, so that we understand each other and can kind of get on the same page and have the same goals. Because as you led with, journalists don't want to go out there and make the world a more conflictual or polarized place. That's not the goal for anyone.
Yeah, wonderful. And Ashton, I have a tricky one for you. Can you talk a little, especially in front of peers, but can you talk a little bit about your growth in covering this space and where you started and maybe where you're at now and how you got there?
Absolutely. And I also definitely talk about this especially when we're working with student journalists, because I want to be very upfront that it has only been maybe 3 or 4 years since some of the things that I'm asking journalists not to do were things that I did. And I pull those examples into my training and say, look at this awful thing that I printed and has my name on it. So I definitely have had the access to people who have helped me grow as a journalist and telling stories in these spaces. And now I'm not doing as much reporting, but I am doing all of the editing and talking to really experienced, wonderful journalists who maybe haven't done as much reporting in this space and need some of that guidance as well. But I mean, I probably did my first story about any kind of drug use when I was at the TV station in 2010, and have continued to do those stories for decades. And over the years, I hope that those stories have become more complete and more compassionate, and told from perspectives that are helping our communities see and understand the disease that we are dealing with here. But I certainly will never shy away from saying that I have made all of these very same mistakes. And Jonathan is really great about, when we go to speak to experts, making the point that most people make mistakes at their jobs, and nobody else really has to hear about it. But journalists make mistakes at their jobs, and everybody saw it on the news, or heard it on the radio, or picked up the newspaper and saw it on the front page. So we as journalists have to be willing to learn, but we also ask experts in this space to educate us as well. I don't know any journalist that isn't willing to listen when we've made a mistake and somebody approaches us from a place of, I'd really like to help make your next story better. I don't know any journalist that would say, absolutely not. I know some journalists at very big national publications that might do that. I don't know any local journalists who would do that. So I think that's part of the equation, too, is us journalists having an open mind and being willing to continually learn about these topics and willing to grow and take advice from the experts in all of these spaces to make our storytelling better.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And I know I do want to thank all of the panelists for just being so vulnerable. So if we could give like a quick round of applause, because these are tough questions. So thank you for being so open. I do have a softball one, and this is for everybody. And I like this one. So when we think about the news media right now, what are they not covering? What are they kind of missing? What stories aren't out there? What would you like to see them focus on more, shine a light on more? And why would that be important for, you know, addiction broadly, but people in long-term recovery or with active addiction?
I'll start. So I have had the privilege of supervising peer recovery support specialists, and I've been learning lots from them for the last 2 years, and listening to their stories and the way that their stories inform their work with individuals just coming into recovery is usually who they're trying to help, is like looking at the long haul. Right? So often we're focused on, oh, this person was doing well, and now they had a recurrence or a relapse, or they returned to use, and we're going to sort of dismiss them. It's like, no, that's part of their recovery. That is part of their recovery. And so when you talk with people who have been at this a while, they've had returns to use, and then returns to abstinence, and then returns to use, and it's all informing and strengthening their recovery. And I think that's a piece of the recovery story that we sometimes miss, because I work with all kinds of people in mostly in early recovery, and they're like, oh, they are devastated when they return to use or have a relapse. And I try and say, no, we're going to learn something from this, and what's next? Like, how are you going to move forward from here and use this negative experience to actually strengthen your recovery? And I think there's a story in that versus just reporting the negative that someone may have become symptomatic again, which is essentially what a relapse or recurrence is.
What I would like to see is more coverage of how the dollars that are being spent to combat this epidemic are being spent in the black community, because many years ago, before many of you were ever born, there was an epidemic called crack, and it basically ravaged the black community, and it was criminalized at that point in time. And now, when this opioid epidemic hit, what we're talking about is a disease. that was a disease also. So I think it's important that the story gets out there of, okay, are these dollars being spent across the board for everyone in every community to make sure that everyone is getting the health care and the services that they need to make sure that this disease gets taken care of?
Yeah, I think covering inequities in this space is really important. I'd also really like to see people covering more solutions. We all know what the problems are, and yet we continue to cover the problems in our communities. And journalists and editors never question if it's worthwhile to continue to do those stories. And yet we've done them over and over and over again. We know the problems, but there are actual solutions. There is proven evidence-based treatment that people right over there on the Health Sciences campus can tell you about. So I would love to see more journalists at all levels covering the solutions that exist in this space, and then covering the lack of access that folks outside of Morgantown have to those solutions.
Yeah, wonderful. I think at this point, if there's any questions from the audience, that would be wonderful. And
I will come to you with a
Ashton
microphone.
will come around with a microphone.
And I know enough of you that I will just choose you with this microphone.
Ashton, when we hire young reporters, typically one of the first beats they get, because it's structured, law enforcement, courts, and they go in and they see someone arrested, they see them arraigned, they see them plead and sentence. And you do that every day for 6 months before you get a chance to move on to something else. How do you see us? And I think in some sense, that experience stigmatizes the people they're dealing with. I mean, you begin to see that every day. How do we break that?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. So we constantly do these stories, and I constantly have fights with my mother whenever we watch the local news, that always the top story is a mugshot and somebody got arrested for drug use. And my mom always says, "Oh, isn't that terrible?" And my response is always, "How did that impact your life? How did that impact your life today, Mom?" And she's always like, "Oh, well, I guess it didn't." So what I would ask of local news, especially, who is stuck in this cycle of crime, I recognize that we've got to train up young reporters somewhere, and that's a fast beat that really helps them get into the groove of working on local news. But why can't we ask them to cover those crime stories that have a larger impact on our community and not just a single individual? We are often putting the faces of people who are experiencing the worst moment of their disease as the top story of our newscast tonight. And that's, I think, the biggest takeaway that we are trying, or the biggest shift that we are trying to make at reporting on addiction is this is a disease. And we would never put the mugshot of a woman who has breast cancer and experienced a relapse as the top story on the 6 o'clock news. Like, we wouldn't do that. So I think it's about a shift in focus and also recognizing impact. Does that story really impact us as a community? Because I think 99.9% of them do not. And we have to stop covering those stories. We don't have enough time to cover stories that don't matter. We should be covering the things that really, really do. Do you all want to add anything?
Yes, what I would like to say, are you in the law enforcement?
No, newspapers.
Newspapers? I think something that would actually help, the reporters are going to be out there and they're going to do what they do, but law enforcement has an opportunity to jump into this fight. I remember early on when I was with Community Corrections, and they introduced the idea of law enforcement carrying Narcan. Oh, they were up in arms about that. They were, "Oh, no, that's not what we do." But you know what? It's all about saving lives. It's about saving lives. And so now there are other programs available, such as law enforcement assisted diversion programs, where law enforcement can show more of a compassionate hand instead of always having that heavy punitive hand, and they can work to help individuals get into the recovery services that they need. And that will also help take some of the burden off of them, because a lot of what I saw when I was in community corrections was that revolving door of individuals who were just coming in and out of the system repeatedly.
Are you seeing?
We have folks on the live stream. I want them to hear you.
Oh, okay. Are you? I guess a little background. You talked about the crack epidemic, and I remember when I first started covering courts. That was at that time, and I would see young black men sentenced to 10 years in prison for a couple grams of cocaine, and white attorneys given probation for having large amounts of powder cocaine, and that seemed to be allowed. That was acceptable to the law enforcement and to the courts because they were doing the sentencing. Are you seeing a change now? You talk about programs that exist. Is that becoming more prevalent, or is the example you're citing, is that more the exception?
I'm not quite understanding your question.
The type of treatment, the attitude of law enforcement, maybe is the better way to phrase it. The attitude of law enforcement of helping or recognizing the stigma and working to correct the addiction as opposed to just putting people in jail. Is that changing?
Here in this area, I see quite a bit of, there are good systems, there are good programs here in place. They have the state drug court program that they run through just about every county in the area. They have the federal drug court programs so that individuals who are caught up in the system, and law enforcement has a lot to do with who gets in and out of these systems, because they'll ask, will you recommend this individual for this program? So, that's an important part. I'm on the federal drug court treatment team in Clarksburg, and, I see a lot of individuals come through. I don't see quite as many black individuals come through the program, but we have to keep in mind, we're in West Virginia, too. And this state is 97% white. So, but we have good programs. Law enforcement, they're engaging more, and I think it's starting to balance out, but, there's still work to be done.
If I could address your first question too, about journalists broadly and covering that topic, we do explain a lot to those experts that when we do the training, that's a lot of how journalists cut their teeth, and so it kind of brings a different perspective to of course when the sheriff says something, they trust the sheriff because they spent a year covering the sheriff, so that makes a ton of sense, and trying to help the experts understand that maybe that's where they're coming from. But I would add, because I'm the researcher, there is some research to suggest that if you present these stories, and Mark touched on it, Laura touched on it, as more complex, and you provide that additional context and background, we are less likely to view it as individual X is to blame for this thing that put them in prison, in this case, for their addiction. And so if you can help your journalists come at it with that empathy, sort of compassionate and really nuanced approach, at least in addiction, that's shown to shift some of that blame and reduce the stigma, which, of course, is what we're hoping to do anyways. Yeah.
How do we kind of weed through some of the information that does get put out there? I'm a state government reporter. I cover legislature. I cover congressional. Somebody had mentioned the rainbow fentanyl thing. I got a press release from Shelley Moore Capito's office, U.S. Senator Shelley Moore Capito's office, because she recorded a PSA. I don't know a ton about drug use, but I'd like to think that if I'm a drug dealer or whoever, I'm not giving out free fentanyl in bags of candy to kids, because I would like to make some money off that. I don't know. I ended up ignoring that press release because I have to triage throughout the day. But, we get stuff like that all the time. During the last legislative session, we had more bills brought out in regards to fentanyl. I think they made criminalization of if a police officer gets injured, breathing in a thing of it. But at the same time, there's a lot of information out there that says that's not really truly as big of an issue as what is made out to be. But of course, that's something media latches onto as well, because it gets headlines, it gets people riled up. How do we triage some of that stuff, especially when we have our short deadlines and we have to, for example, a legislative session? I'm covering multiple stories during a legislative session, and that could easily get lost in the shuffle. How do you know to raise something up to say, well, this is nonsense, or even ignore something?
Dr. Lander, do you want to maybe talk about that one a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge because the science or the research always lags way behind the story, so to speak. And it is important to get life-saving information to people if there are dangerous things that are out there that people need to look out for. And so I'm not sure that I have an answer other than to acknowledge it's really hard because it takes time to do the research. So one of the examples that was floating around was that younger kids were using THC that was laced with fentanyl. Now the science community said, that's not possible. And what we have come to find is that it is absolutely possible. But the traditional, you can't actually smoke fentanyl, right? And so the way that it was getting ingested was a slightly different mechanism than people were used to, but it was happening. And so it's difficult because the pace of the media is so quick. And how we develop knowledge about anything is not necessarily fast. So somehow balancing it with, which is merely saying this is what we know now, and we need to find out more, rather than this is the fact, and we know it's the end of the story.
Yeah, I think a lot of reporting in this space and a lot of stories that we do in this space, it's about finding the appropriate expert. And I don't believe that you do this, Stephen, but I know that a lot of journalists rely on the people that they already know, right? Well, the sheriff is a respected individual in my community, and they said that they would talk to me about this, and they said I could come over at 12 o'clock, and so I'm going to quote them. But it's about vetting our experts appropriately and understanding who the actual expert is. And it is not appropriate for us to rely on politicians to understand the science. And it's not appropriate for us to rely on law enforcement or, people hate this when I say it, and I look at Jonathan because he always supports me through. It's not appropriate for us to rely on EMTs and firefighters. They are not the medical experts in this space. So it is a little bit on us to keep that in mind. This person is not the expert, and if you have the time to find that person or create a relationship with that person in advance, as you know that you're going into a session and you know these bills are going to come up, is there a person that I can even just text and say, hey, what do you think about this bill really quick? I don't need to quote you, but if you can go in background and give me the context so that I can tell this story. So part of it is on us to build those relationships just like we would anywhere else, but it's remembering who is the actual expert in this space. And I promise you that member of the House of Delegates is not the expert, right? They didn't write that bill.
And I love Mark's point earlier, too, about being proactive and building that bench of resources as a journalist. A lot of what we do is smell tests. I'll just have a journalist say, hey, I heard this thing. Does this make sense? And we can thumbs up, thumbs down, and they go write a different story, or they run it down. So that can be really helpful. But, of course, if you're in that session and I need to know now because I got a deadline, it's having that person that can quickly turn that for you and say, yeah, that's probably worth writing, or we're not sure yet, to Laura's point, and let's have a fuller discussion later. Mark, you were going to say something?
Yes, I was. What I was going to add was, I found that a lot of times the best place to get your information is right there from the boots on the ground. And, basically in most counties or a lot of counties in West Virginia right now, they have put together what are called QRTs, quick response teams. You have someone from your fire department, your police department, you have someone who's usually a peer recovery support specialist, and your hospitals are also starting to employ the peer recovery support specialist. So there's someone in the hospital also, and basically they're keeping an eye on what's happening in real time out here on the streets, the things that are actually going on, and finding it out. So that may be some way that you could actually start to peel back and find out, is there truth to this? Is there no truth to this?
I think, what do you think? We got time for one more?
Yeah.
I think one more. Yeah, Jesse.
As the guy with the camera, I feel like I need to talk about images, and you kind of talked a little bit about it with mugshots. That's one kind of imaging that propagates stigma. Maybe you guys can talk a little bit more about that marriage when we take. It's one thing to have a headline. It's another thing to pair that with an image in terms of propagating stigma. You know, what's the way we can break that cycle, or do you just want to talk about that in general?
So my biggest pet peeve is when journalists or other people use the term addicted baby. And my chair has a horrifying image of what that calls up for me, which is an infant, you know, injecting themselves with a substance. I mean, like, this is not a thing. This is not a thing. There is no addicted baby. So addiction is a chronic, relapsing brain disease that involves compulsion and obsession. That is not a thing for a baby. Can babies be exposed in utero? Absolutely, to substances. Can babies experience withdrawal when they're born? Absolutely. That is true. But so whenever I hear that image, whenever I hear that word, I think of that crazy image that someone presented me with. And so pairing images of compassion with people who struggle with substance use disorders can be very powerful. Pairing images of hope or images of struggle can be really helpful. But stigmatizing images just serve to keep people underground. I mean, the main thing that stigma does in terms of treatment is keep people away from treatment, keep people from seeking help, keep people from admitting they have a problem because of the shame that's connected to stigma. Oh, and the correct language is an infant who's been exposed to substances or an infant who's experiencing withdrawal.
In your question, are you speaking of the mental image or the actual physical image? Physical image. I'll be honest, I'll tell you right now, I've actually taken pictures of an individual during a drug raid. You know, I feel that there are two different individuals there. An individual who is actually addicted and doing drugs, or an individual who's selling drugs. If an individual is selling drugs, I don't have any problems at all, no qualms. I'm going to take your picture as they walk you, perp walk you, handcuffs, the whole 9 yards. But for someone who is really, you know, they're at the lowest point of their lives, as has been said before. And for me to take their picture right now, I have to look back and say, how would I have liked? And I can give you an example. At one point in time, I remember a situation that I got into, and I was sitting at the Clarksburg Police Department. One of the police officers, now they were going to take me across the street. It's just, 50 yards across the road. And they were going to take me over for booking over here at the sheriff's office. And the one police officer wanted to take me out back. He's going to put me in a cruiser. He's going to drive me over to the police station. There was another police officer there. They were insistent. No, I'm going to handcuff him, and I'm going to walk him right across the street. Middle of the day, downtown Clarksburg, and I'm going to be walked across. I was furious. I was like, oh, no, it's not going to happen. Well, of course, they went heads on about this until it ended up, yes, I was put in the back of a police car, and I was taken across that way. But I have to look at the situation that way. How would I feel if it were myself? How would I feel if it were my brother or a family member or my best friend or one of his family members?
Yeah, I think that I'll just also add, it's easy for us to think about these images for people who are actively using drugs or in active addiction, but we tend to also overlook or forget about the consequences for people who are in recovery. Like, we are really trying to get those people to share their stories with us because we want to tell stories of hope, and that's where those stories come from. And yet we sometimes can forget about the consequences of the photos that we are making, or maybe the video that we are taking in those instances. Someday I'm going to give this example, and it's not actually going to be true, but it always is. I am single. I'm 32 years old. I work at this university. I probably work something like 50, 55 hours a week. If somebody was going to do a story about me and about my life and came to my home and said, can I just get some environmental pictures? What would you be doing? And I took them into my kitchen and said, usually I'd be cooking dinner. And there is a stack of dirty dishes this high. And if they took my picture in front of that and it was published, the worst thing that could happen is I would feel embarrassed. Like, oh, crap, I should have done those dishes. But if we want to do the same thing and ask a person in recovery, ask a mom of 3 kids who also worked 60 hours last week and had to take those kids to basketball and dance classes, and what is she doing typically right now? Well, usually I'm making dinner. Great, I'll take some pictures of you. And she's got a sink full of dirty dishes, and we publish that picture. The consequence is people in the community saying, she's not responsible, that home is dirty, we better call Child Protective Services and have those kids taken. So I think when it comes to photos and video, you know, we as journalists, we should collect everything. We should. Like, we should collect the reality of their lives and of their experiences, absolutely. But we have to make ethical choices when it comes to what we are going to then use and what we're going to share. And think about the consequences beyond, yeah, that's her reality, but you also took some photos in the living room and it was like cleaned up and everything was fine, and that is also her reality. So I think when it comes to images especially, it is definitely an ethical decision that we have to think about and we have to make.
Thank you. Just one more. You guys have that text. What about mugshots?
Mugshots.
Where are you with mugshots?
Yeah, I don't think we should ever use mugshots. I mean, I think probably I don't feel so badly about the person that's being arrested for distributing drugs and like making my community a horrible place, and we have, you know, that kind of information. I don't necessarily feel as strongly about that, but I think somebody who has been arrested for use is probably a person who is in a disease, and I don't see any point to use that mugshot. We've also like cannot then erase that photo, right? It always exists. Yeah, oh,
Correct.
That's a great point, April. They've been arrested, but they have not been convicted. Also a fantastic point.
And like Mark said, yeah, you got to think about an individual in long-term recovery 10, 15 years later. Like, how are they going to feel about they apply for a job and that mugshot pops up when I Google them? I mean, I can't take that down. And like Mark said, I mean, if that's the lowest point of their life, should that really be tagging along for every single step in the rest of their journey? I wouldn't want that.
However, I look at it, you know, on both sides. You know, it's public information. Once that individual has that encounter with the police and they are arrested, that's now public information. And that information is going to get out there. I'm not crazy about the mugshot thing, but it's going to happen. I look at the little mugshot website every day because I work with a lot of individuals who struggle with substance abuse. If they go AWOL on me, that's the first place I go. I go right in there and I start looking through the counties that surround the county where they live to see, has this individual been incarcerated? You know, have they gotten themselves in some kind of trouble? So
I think we're pushing on time.
We are, yeah. So this has been wonderful. Thank you for the great questions. It's a bunch of journalists, so that helps. Our QR code up there just takes you to our website. Our website's reportingonaddiction.org, just to learn more about our work, the different initiatives that we're rolling out. We love all the support today, and I would ask again for an applause for our wonderful panelists. They were so vulnerable and brilliant tonight.